I shouldn't have opened that door, but when I did, something inside me shifted in a way I still don't fully understand. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, almost invisible. The kind of moment that doesn't feel like a mistake until it's already too late to undo it. And the worst part is, a part of me knew, even then, that I wasn't as innocent as I wanted to believe. My marriage wasn't broken. At least, not in the way people usually describe. There were no fights, no shouting, no obvious cracks anyone else could point to. From the outside, it looked stable, even comfortable. But comfort can be deceiving. It can slowly turn into distance, without you realizing when exactly it happened. My husband had become a routine more than a partner. He left early, came back late, always tired, always distracted. Conversations turned into short exchanges about bills, food, plans that never really happened. The warmth we once had didn't disappear overnight. It faded, quietly, like something we both stopped noticing until it was already gone. At first, I told myself this was normal. That this is what long-term relationships look like. People grow busy. Life becomes predictable. Love changes. That's what I kept repeating in my head whenever the silence between us felt too heavy, but silence has a way of growing. It fills spaces you didn't even know existed. And eventually, it started to feel like I was living with someone who no longer saw me. Not really. That's when he started coming around more often. My husband's friend had always been there in the background. Occasional visits, casual conversations, nothing that ever stood out. But slowly, his presence became more frequent. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was just someone my husband trusted, someone who felt familiar enough to not question, but familiarity can be dangerous when you're already feeling invisible. He noticed things. Small things. The kind my husband used to notice, but stopped somewhere along the way. If I changed something in the house, he'd mention it. If I seemed tired, he'd ask. Not in a forced way, not out of politeness, but like he actually meant it. The first time it happened, I brushed it off. The second time, I smiled a little longer than I should have. By the third time, I found myself waiting for it. It wasn't anything obvious. That's what made it so easy to ignore. There were no inappropriate words, no crossed lines. Just conversations that lasted a little longer. Eye contact that lingered just a second too much. A tone that felt different, and I hated how much I noticed it. I told myself it was nothing. That I was just overthinking. That I was reading into things, because my own life felt empty in ways I didn't want to admit. But even as I told myself that, I didn't pull away. If anything, I leaned into it without realizing. There's a certain kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being unseen. And when someone suddenly sees you, even in the smallest ways, it feels bigger than it should. He didn't try to impress me. He didn't cross any obvious boundaries. That's what made it worse. It felt natural. Easy. Like something that didn't need to be questioned. Sometimes the three of us would sit together, and I'd notice the difference without meaning to. My husband, half present, scrolling through his phone or lost in his thoughts. And his friend, engaged, listening, responding, making the conversation feel alive. I shouldn't have compared them. I knew that. But once the thought entered my mind, it didn't leave. It grew. There were moments when I caught myself thinking about things I shouldn't. Wondering how something so simple, just being heard, could feel so significant. Wondering when exactly I started caring about his presence more than I should, and every time that thought crossed my mind, I pushed it away. Told myself it was wrong. That I needed to be careful. That I was still in control. But control is a fragile thing when you don't even realize you're losing it. My husband trusted him. That was the part that made everything feel even more complicated. There was no suspicion, no tension. Just complete trust. The kind that makes you feel guilty for thoughts you haven't even acted on yet. And maybe that's where it really began, not with an action, but with a feeling I refused to confront. The house started to feel different when he was around. Lighter, somehow. Less suffocating. Conversations flowed easier. Time moved differently. And when he left, the silence returned, heavier than before. I started noticing the pattern, and I didn't stop it. There were days when my husband would leave us alone without thinking twice. It was normal. Innocent. Just two people sitting in the same space, talking about nothing important. But even in those moments, something unspoken lingered beneath the surface, not obvious. Not undeniable. Just there, waiting. I remember telling myself that as long as nothing happened, it didn't mean anything. That thoughts don't count. That feelings can be ignored if you don't act on them. But I was wrong, because sometimes, the moment doesn't start when something happens. It starts long before that, in the quiet choices you don't even realize you're making. And that night, when everything finally crossed the line, I wasn't as unprepared as I told myself I was. He started coming over more often, and at some point, I stopped seeing it as a coincidence. My husband would invite him without asking me, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And I would nod, pretending it didn't matter, even though a small part of me had already begun to anticipate those visits. It wasn't about excitement. Not at first. It was something quieter than that. A shift in the way the day felt when I knew he'd be around. The house didn't seem as heavy. Time didn't drag as much. I told myself it was just the change in routine, nothing more. But I knew better. Our conversations became longer, more personal. It stopped being about casual topics, and turned into something deeper, without either of us acknowledging it. He'd ask questions my husband hadn't asked in years. Not because my husband didn't care, but because somewhere along the way, he stopped trying, and I answered. That was my first mistake. I told him things I didn't even say out loud to myself. How lonely the house felt sometimes. How silence had become a normal part of my life. How I missed being noticed, not in a grand way, but in small, meaningful ways that made me feel like I still existed beyond routines. He didn't interrupt. He didn't dismiss it. He just listened, and somehow, that made it worse, because once someone truly listens to you, it becomes harder to go back to being ignored. I started catching myself thinking about him when he wasn't there. Wondering when he'd visit next. Replaying conversations in my head, analyzing the way he looked at me, the pauses, the tone. I told myself it was harmless, Just thoughts passing through, but they weren't passing. They were staying. There's a dangerous comfort in being understood. It lowers your guard without you realizing it. You stop filtering yourself. You stop holding back. And before you know it, you've shared parts of yourself that were never meant to be shared with someone like him. I tried to create distance. I really did. There were moments when I avoided eye contact, kept conversations short, found reasons to leave the room. But it never lasted. The effort felt forced, unnatural, like I was pretending something didn't exist when it clearly did, and he noticed. He didn't call it out directly, but there were moments when his tone changed, when his words carried something unspoken. A quiet awareness that we were both circling around something neither of us had the courage to name. That's when the tension started to build. It wasn't obvious to anyone else. To my husband, everything was the same. Normal. Safe. But between us, there was a shift. Subtle, but undeniable. Conversations would pause at the wrong moments. Silences would stretch longer than they should. And in those silences, everything felt louder. I told myself to stop. I reminded myself of what was at stake. A marriage that wasn't perfect, but still real. A trust that hadn't been broken. A line that hadn't been crossed, but every time I thought about pulling away, I remembered how it felt to be seen again, and I hesitated. That hesitation became my second mistake. One evening, my husband came home later than usual, already distracted, already halfway somewhere else in his mind. He mentioned he had to step out again, something urgent, something he didn't bother explaining in detail. It wasn't unusual. By then, I had gotten used to not asking too many questions. What mattered was that he left, and his friend stayed. It wasn't planned. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. There was a reason for him to stay, something small, something practical that made sense in the moment. But even as I accepted it, I felt that quiet tension settle in again. The house felt different that night, too quiet. Too still. Like something was waiting to happen. We didn't speak much at first. Just a few words here and there, nothing meaningful. But silence between two people who are already thinking too much isn't empty. It's full of everything you're trying not to say. I could feel it building again. Every glance felt heavier. Every movement more noticeable. I became aware of things I had ignored before. The distance between us. The way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The way I avoided looking back for too long. And then I realized something that made my chest tighten. I wasn't uncomfortable. I should have been. I should have felt the need to leave, to create space, to protect what was still intact. But instead, I stayed exactly where I was, caught between knowing what was right and wanting something I couldn't justify. That was the moment everything shifted, not because something happened, but because I stopped convincing myself that nothing would. He stood there for a second longer than necessary, like he was deciding something. And I felt it. That pause. That hesitation. It mirrored my own. Neither of us moved away. Neither of us said what needed to be said, and somehow, that silence said everything. I remember the sound of the door closing softly behind him as he stepped further inside. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just enough to make the space between us feel smaller than it should have been. I should have walked away. I didn't. I stayed there, completely aware of what I was risking, yet unable to break the moment before it could turn into something irreversible, because deep down, I had already crossed a line long before that night. And as he looked at me in a way that left no room for denial, I knew this wasn't going to end the way I kept telling myself it would. He didn't move closer right away, and somehow that made the moment heavier. The distance between us wasn't wide, but it felt loaded, like the space itself was holding its breath. I became painfully aware of everything, the sound of my own breathing, the faint hum in the room, the way the silence seemed to press down on my chest. He didn't look confused. That's what unsettled me the most. He looked certain, like he had already made a decision long before this moment. I searched his expression for hesitation, for doubt, for any sign that this was all in my head. But all I found was a quiet intensity that made it impossible to pretend nothing was happening. "You're not okay," he said softly. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, and the accuracy of it hit harder than it should have. I opened my mouth to deny it, to say something casual, something that could shift us back to safe ground. But no words came out. The truth sat heavy on my tongue, and I hated how visible it probably was on my face. He took a step forward, slow enough that I could have stopped him. I didn't. That single step changed the air between us. The distance felt smaller, the silence thicker. I could see the conflict in his eyes, but beneath it was something else. Something neither of us had admitted out loud. "This isn't right," he said quietly. My heart skipped at that, because hearing it made it feel real in a way thoughts never could. I nodded, not because I was strong enough to stop what was happening, but because I needed to believe I still had control. "I know," I whispered, but knowing didn't change the way my pulse quickened. It didn't stop the way my thoughts scattered, or how every part of me felt torn between retreat and surrender. I could feel the weight of every unspoken thing between us pressing in, daring one of us to step back. He reached out, then hesitated halfway, his hand suspended in the space between us. It wasn't a confident move. It was careful, almost questioning, like he was asking permission without saying the words. That moment should have been the one where I stopped it, where I stepped back, where I chose clarity over impulse. I didn't. I stayed perfectly still, and my stillness was the only answer he needed. His fingers brushed against mine, barely there, but enough to send a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. My breath caught, and the world seemed to narrow to that single point of contact. It wasn't forceful or demanding. It was hesitant, almost fragile, like both of us were terrified of what would happen next, and yet, neither of us pulled away. He exhaled slowly, and I realized how close he was now. Close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath, close enough that I could no longer hide behind uncertainty. Every rational thought screamed that this was the moment to stop, to reclaim control, to end it before the line was crossed beyond repair. But my body didn't move. My mind was a storm of contradictions. Guilt clashed with longing, fear with need, logic with impulse. I thought of my husband, of trust, of consequences. But those thoughts felt distant, muffled, drowned out by the immediacy of the moment unfolding right in front of me. "I don't want to hurt anyone," he said, his voice strained. The words should have been enough to break the moment. They weren't. If anything, they made it heavier, because they acknowledged everything we were both trying not to say. This wasn't confusion. This was a choice waiting to happen. "I know," I whispered again, though I wasn't sure what I meant anymore. He leaned in slightly, not enough to close the distance completely, but enough that the possibility became undeniable. My chest tightened. Every instinct screamed at me to step back, to create space, to protect what could still be saved. But there was another voice, quieter but persistent, reminding me how long I had felt unseen, unheard, untouched in ways that mattered. That voice didn't justify anything, but it made resisting harder than it should have been. When his forehead almost touched mine, my eyes closed on instinct. Not because I wanted to escape the moment, but because I was overwhelmed by it. My heartbeat filled my ears, loud and uneven. Then it happened, not rushed, not sudden, but slow and hesitant, like both of us were afraid of the point of no return even as we crossed it. The closeness, the touch, the way the air between us disappeared, it all felt unreal and terrifyingly real at the same time. There was no triumph in it. No excitement. Just a flood of emotion too complicated to name. For a split second, everything else disappeared, the guilt, the consequences, the world beyond that moment. But reality doesn't stay silent for long. The second it ended, the weight crashed back in, heavier than before. The guilt was immediate, sharp, almost suffocating. I stepped back instinctively, my hands trembling, my breath uneven. His expression shifted too, conflict, regret, realization all hitting at once. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The silence said everything. What had happened couldn't be undone, couldn't be explained away, couldn't be forgotten. The line we had been circling for so long was finally crossed, and there was no pretending otherwise. He looked like he wanted to say something, to fix it, to apologize, but no words came. I didn't want apologies. I wanted to rewind time, to undo the choices that led us here, to erase the weight now sitting between us. But that was impossible, and as the reality of what we had done settled in, one thought kept echoing in my mind, relentless and unforgiving. Nothing would ever be the same after this.
The silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt crowded, filled with everything we hadn't said and everything we couldn't take back. I went home carrying it like a weight in my chest, heavy enough to change the way I walked, the way I breathed, the way I looked at the person waiting for me on the other side of the door. My partner greeted me the same way they always did. A small smile. A familiar question about my day. Their voice was warm, easy, unguarded. It should have made me feel safe. Instead, it made me feel like a stranger standing in the wrong life. I answered in half-truths. Work was fine. Traffic was bad. I was tired. The words came out smooth, practiced, like I'd been rehearsing them on the way home. They nodded, accepting them without suspicion, and that trust hurt more than if they had doubted me. We sat together that night, close but not touching. The space between us felt louder than any argument. I kept thinking about how easily I used to lean into them without thinking, how natural it felt to belong there. Now, every movement felt deliberate, like I was afraid of revealing something just by being too close. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't check it. That was new. I went to bed with my partner's back turned toward me, their breathing slow and steady. I stared into the dark, replaying his words over and over, hearing them in my own head instead of his voice. You've already been here with me. The more I thought about it, the more I hated how true it felt. The next day, everything felt slightly off, like the world had shifted an inch to the left and I was the only one who noticed. My partner laughed at something I said, and I flinched at how normal it sounded. He passed me in the hallway later, our shoulders almost brushing, and I felt a jolt of awareness. I didn't want that. We didn't talk about what happened. We didn't need to. It lived in the way he avoided my eyes, in the way he paused before speaking, in the way the air between us felt charged instead of comfortable. Whatever he had offered, whatever I hadn't refused clearly enough, it lingered that my partner started asking more questions. Not directly. Not accusing. Just small things. If I was okay. If I wanted to talk. If something was bothering me. Each question felt like a door opening that I wasn't ready to walk through, that I kept saying no, but at night, when the house was quiet, I'd lie awake and imagine what would happen if I said yes instead. Yes, something is wrong. Yes, I've been leaning on someone else. Yes, I don't know where my loyalty has gone. The conversations played out in my head, ending in tears, in anger, in words I couldn't take back. I stayed silent, that he pulled back, too. The messages slowed. The calls stopped. When we were in the same room, we kept our distance like there was an invisible line we both agreed not to cross. It should have been a relief. It should have made things easier, that it didn't. The absence felt louder than the presence ever had. I missed the way he used to look at me, like he knew me completely. I missed the comfort of being understood without explaining myself. And I hated myself for missing it. Did my partner notice that, too? The way I'd stare at my phone even when it didn't light up. The way my thoughts seemed somewhere else. One evening, they reached for my hand and held it longer than usual, like they were trying to anchor me in place. "Are you still here?" they asked quietly. The question landed harder than any accusation could have. That I wanted to say yes. I wanted to mean it. That I squeezed their hand, hoping the gesture could say what my words couldn't. They smiled, but it didn't quite reach their eyes. Days turned into weeks. The tension never exploded. It just settled in, a constant hum beneath everything we did. Meals tasted the same, but felt different. Conversations sounded the same, but carried less weight. Even laughter felt careful, like we were both afraid of cracking something fragile. One night, I found myself standing alone in the kitchen, the house dark around me, the only light coming from the window. I looked at my reflection in the glass and barely recognized the person staring back. I saw someone who had tried to hold on to two worlds at once and ended up not fully belonging to either. My phone buzzed. A message from him. That I didn't open it right away. I just stared at the screen, feeling the familiar pull and the familiar guilt rise up together, tangled and inseparable. I thought about my partner, asleep down the hall, trusting me in a way I wasn't sure I deserved anymore. That I thought about the moment everything had changed without anything actually happening. That I let the phone go dark in my hand. That I still don't know if that was the right choice or just another way of delaying one I'll eventually have to make. All I know is that some lines don't need to be crossed to change everything. Sometimes, just standing close enough to see them clearly is enough to make you realize you can never go back to where you were before.